Now, I love to watch people do sign language. I was sharing in first service that I have a cousin that years ago worked in a factory where there was a deaf girl that came to work there, and it struck her after a couple weeks. She realized that this girl had no one to talk to. And so she began trying to learn sign language so she could talk to her, and that actually ended up becoming a career for her. She became an interpreter for the deaf. I had an experience years ago when Burnett and I were preparing to move to Southern California so I could start seminary. I went to seminary at Talbot, which is part of Biola University, and I decided to fly down in advance to just kind of check out the campus and look at housing, things like that. And when I got down there, they gave me a voucher for lunch one day at the cafeteria. And as is true of many universities, during the summer when regular classes are in session, oftentimes there are outside groups that will use the campus and for conferences and other things. And that was true of the week that I was there. There was a large conference going on. I didn't know anything about the conference, but when I went to get in line for lunch, it struck me that I'd never been in a line like this before. It was very quiet. Nobody was talking. And yet everybody was talking because it was a convention for the deaf. And I was the only guy in line that wasn't deaf, except I was the only guy in line that couldn't hear what was being said, and it was going on all around me. You know, when we reflect on personal handicaps, limitations, oftentimes it causes us to ponder deeper things. And today we're going to look at kind of a lengthy passage because I want you to see what I think is a bigger picture that Mark is trying to convey in the stories that he is retelling of Jesus' life. In our very first sermon, when we started the Gospel of Mark, I gave you some history on it, some background, and we talked about the fact that it appears that what Mark did was he was a disciple, a follower, if you will, of the Apostle Peter, and that what he did was he wrote down the stories that Peter had told. And one of the early church fathers that talked about this, a man named Papias, said that John the Elder used to say, Mark, having become Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately everything he remembered, though not in order, of the things either said or done by Christ. He neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, followed Peter, who used to give his teaching in the form of creai, or anecdote, but had no intention of giving an ordered account of the Lord's sayings. So Papias says Mark wrote down Peter's stories, but he didn't necessarily try and write them all down in chronological order. And so when Mark focuses on specific stories and when he puts them in a particular order, it's good to ask yourself, is there a bigger point he's trying to make here? And I think the passage we're going to look at this morning is a good illustration of that. We're going to look at three miracles. Two of them are miracles of healing of physical handicaps. One of them is another feeding of a large group of people. We earlier saw the feeding of the 5,000. We're going to look at the feeding of the 4,000 as well. But all of them, I think, convey a deeper lesson or lessons about faith. So let's start off by looking at the first miracle, which is the healing of a deaf man. Mark chapter 7, verse 31. Then he, that is Jesus, returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. So once again, we see Jesus on the move. You may recall that as a feature of Mark's story that you constantly see Jesus on the move from place to place. And so he's on the move again. And this time, if you were to track this out on a map, when he went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, you would see that he took a rather circuitous route. It appears that he intentionally tried to go around Galilee, which is where the bulk of his ministry happened. It seems that Jesus is still trying to kind of hold the crowds in check and not let things snowball too quickly with the way his popularity is gaining. And so he takes this roundabout way, and he gets to Decapolis, which again is a largely Gentile area. And once he arrives there, it says that they, a group of people, brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. Now, it would appear that this man had perhaps not been deaf his whole life, because he did know how to speak, but he also had a speech impediment because he could no longer hear himself. So Jesus, taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be open. It's an interesting facet of Jesus' ministry that you at times see him performing miracles in a very public way. He wants people to see what he is doing. And those miracles often were a testament to his legitimacy, his power, that what he was teaching, what he was saying really did have authority behind them because the miracles bore that out. There are other times, though, that he seems to purposely try to keep things out of the spotlight. That Jesus was constantly weighing the personal needs of the situation along with what the effect it would have on the crowds and their momentum. As I've thought about this story, and I've thought about this deaf man, that Jesus knew he was about to unstop his ears, I have thought that there may well be more going on than just Jesus wanting to avoid the spotlight. If you think about it, this man has lived in silence for many years. Jesus is about to unstop his ears, and he's going to hear. And of course, if that happened in a large crowd situation, there's going to be all kinds of exclamations and noise and talk, and it's going to be overwhelming. I think that Jesus, in an act of grace, takes this man aside to a quiet place and says, I'm going to restore your hearing, but I'm going to do it in a peaceful place. And Jesus does it in a way that engages in language this man can understand. I think we really have to see this story through the perspective of the deaf man looking at Jesus. What is he seeing? What is he experiencing? Well, the first thing that he experiences is touch. Jesus takes his fingers and he places them into the man's ears. And the sign language is clear. I'm about to touch your hearing. And then he spits and he touches his lips. And the message is clear. I'm about to touch your tongue. The 2 points where you're handicapped are about to be touched. And then Jesus steps back and he looks up to heaven. What does that tell this man? What's about to happen to you is going to happen because of God. And then he does something very interesting. It says that he sighed. What was the sighing about? Again, as I've thought about this, if you see this from the deaf man's perspective, the idea of sighing is just he just breathed out heavily. He looks up, he looks at the man, and he blows on him. And what I actually think you have going on is there is an allusion to the Trinity here. It is God the Son saying that God the Father is about to touch your ears and your tongue through the power of his Spirit. Is there any precedent for that? John chapter 20, verses 21 and 22, much later, Jesus talking to his disciples. He said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." I think Jesus is communicating to this man that right now you have the full attention of the triune God, and he's about to touch you and heal you at your point of greatest need. And then Jesus speaks, and he says, Ephphatha, be open. It's a very gentle, very quiet word. I think the miracle was simultaneous with the words. I think the first word this man heard was a quiet, gentle Ephphatha. Be open. Be loosed. And the healing happens. Healing occurs. Well, then we have the not-so-secret that follows up on this. Jesus charged them, this man and his friends who had brought him, to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. I think this actually happened over a period of a few days, right? Jesus says, don't tell anybody. They go out, they start talking. Jesus calls them back. Guys, I said, don't tell anybody. They go out, tell more people. He calls them back. Guys, I said, don't tell anybody. It says, the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. Who could blame him? There's great irony here. There's a mute man that can talk, and he can't stop talking about what has happened to him. And it says that they were astonished beyond measure. The only time this word is used in the New Testament, in the Greek, they said, he has done all things well. He teaches like no one we've ever heard. He does things we've never seen. He even causes deaf people to hear and mute people to speak. Who is this man? Well, what I'd like for you to do is take this story and just bracket it for a minute, okay? And I want to jump ahead to the third miracle. The third miracle is the healing of a blind man. A friend of mine took this picture and posted it. You just have to ponder that for a minute. Healing a blind man. Jesus once again is on the move, and he comes to Bethsaida. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village, and when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." A lot of similarities between the story of the healing of the blind man and the healing of the deaf man. I think it's interesting that for the deaf man who had been mute, who couldn't speak, he said, "Don't go and tell anybody." He doesn't actually say that to the blind man. He doesn't say, "Don't go tell anybody." He says, "Don't even physically show up in the village." How come? Well, what's amazing is when a deaf mute guy starts talking to you. But you don't need a blind guy to say anything to be aware that something dramatic has happened. You just see him walking boldly down the street, not worrying about where he's going, and people are going to notice. And Jesus says, don't even walk back in the village, because it was going to stir up more turmoil, more crowd enthusiasm than Jesus wanted right at that point. The blind man compared to the deaf man. It's interesting to put these two stories side by side and look at the similarities. First, in both cases, Jesus is in a largely Gentile area. Again, the gospel was not just for the Jews. It was for all people. In both cases, the men are brought to Jesus by friends. In both cases, those friends beg Jesus to heal their friend. In both situations, Jesus chooses to handle the situation privately. He takes them aside. And in both, I believe he speaks in the language of the handicap. To the deaf man, he touches him. He blows on him. Things that that man could understand from where he was. To the blind man, Jesus spits and touches his eyes, very tactile. It says that Jesus had led him by the hand to a private place. And then we have the healing itself. It says that Jesus prayed for him, and the man looked up and he said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking," which tells me that, like with the deaf man, this guy had probably been able to see at some point. I mean, he had some conception of what people look like. He had some conception of what trees look like, and he could make that association. But somewhere he had lost the ability. And so now he looks and he says, "Well, I see men like trees walking." Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. He opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw clearly. Now, this is really unusual. This is the only miracle we have that happens in two parts. Every other time you see Jesus do something, he speaks, he touches, and it's a done deal. And yet in this case, it's a two-part healing. How come? Was it just the fact that it was late in the day and Jesus is kind of low on power? Just didn't muster up quite enough for this one? Or is it kind of like my optometrist when I go in and he, puts the thing in front of my eyes and starts flipping the dial, which is better, this one or this one, or this one or this one? And I'm like, I can't really tell. He goes, well, try this one again. Was that it? Jesus kind of trying to fine-tune the process for this guy? Miracles often have a far greater significance than just the healing, the miracle itself. Jesus spoke in parables often. His words often had a double meaning to them. And it was only people that really stopped and pondered and wanted to know that came to understand the fuller meaning. I think Jesus' actions were often the same. There was a surface thing going on, but there was something deeper being said through it. And I think that with this man and his gradual gaining of sight, we will talk about this more in the weeks ahead, there is something deeper being said about how people came to understand and see who Jesus was. Well, you can chew on that for a few moments while we skip back to miracle number 2, the feeding of the 4,000. Comes out of Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. In those days, when there was again a large crowd and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. His disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them, and started giving them to his disciples to serve to them, and they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. Now, some people have speculated that maybe Mark has just kind of garbled 2 stories together. We looked a couple weeks ago at the feeding of the 5,000, many of the same elements. A lot of people in a desolate place, a few loaves of bread, a few fish, everybody gets fed, and then you pick up a lot of baskets afterwards. And so some have said, well, maybe it's really just one story and Mark got it confused. But Mark is very specific in his details, that this is unique from the one that happened before it. There's a different number of people. And as we're going to see, Jesus himself references both events as being distinct occurrences when he makes a teaching point. If you think about this miracle, if the disciples had really been thinking about it, especially now that they've seen something like this happen twice, what should they have thought of? I mean, they were Jews, they'd been raised, they'd heard all the Old Testament Bible stories. What should have been going through their heads when they see a large group of people in a desolate place being miraculously provided bread to meet their hunger? They should have been thinking about the story of Moses and the manna in the wilderness and God's provision. Again, if they'd been looking from a bigger perspective, they would have said something very significant is being communicated here about who this man Jesus is. Well, so we have 2 stories of physical handicap, and in between them, Mark tells of 2 groups who have faith handicaps. The first one is a kind of spiritual blindness we see displayed by the Pharisees. The Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Now, at one level, this seems like a golden opportunity, right? I mean, these guys have been his enemies up to this point. They haven't been willing to accept what he's doing, but now here they come and they say, hey, if you'll just show us a sign, we'll accept it. So all Jesus has to do to solve the whole problem right now is just show them a sign, right? But if opportunity is knocking, Jesus makes it clear that he does not plan to answer the door. And he asks the first why question. We're going to see two why questions this morning. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Interesting, he uses the term this generation. That term shows up in the Old Testament, and every time it shows up to describe the generation of Israel, it's speaking of the generation of Israel that despite all of the miracles, all the ways that God provided for them, they still refuse to believe him. They still refuse to follow in faith. And Jesus picks up that same language and he applies it now to the Pharisees and those who were their allies and says, what is wrong with this generation? You know, generations have a way of taking on their own identities, don't they? When we talk about this, we talk about boomers and busters and Generation X and Generation Y and millennials, and they have these kind of common denominator characteristics. Sometimes even classes in school take on identities. My class in high school, we had like one of those classes that had a lot of students that excelled. I'm not going to say I was one of them, that's not true, but there were a lot of my classmates that did. We had two of them went to military academies. They were just really a stellar group in my class. Now, my wife was a year ahead of me in Squim High, and her class has the notoriety of staging the first riot on campus at Squim High School. I told her that her 10-year reunion was bigger than the 5-year reunion because most of them were out on parole by then. Not that far from the truth. Jesus saw within those Pharisees a generation, a representative of people whose predominant trait was unbelief. Not just doubt. Doubt, there's no sin in doubt. All of us wrestle with doubt, things we don't understand, things we can't figure out, and we ask God the why questions, and we try to sort through it, and that's an important part of our faith, that we wrestle with the questions and we look for the answers. Nothing wrong with doubt. But unbelief is something different. Unbelief erects objections and keeps on erecting them. And it's not interested in finding answers. It's more interested in just finding new objections. Know what it says about the Pharisees? It says the Pharisees came to argue. They didn't come to find an answer. They came to pick a fight. And what they wanted was they said, we want a sign from heaven. Now, they'd seen miracles. They'd seen lots of miracles. And in fact, what had they done when they saw Jesus cast a demon out of a man, that's something that no one else could do? What did they say? Well, you must have done that by the power of Satan. Jesus, what do you people want? They didn't really want evidence. It's not because they were wrestling with doubt. They were setting up obstacles, and they're saying, well, we need something bigger. We need a sign from heaven. We need the clouds to roll back. We need fire to fall. And you know what? We don't think you're going to do it. We don't think you can. And as soon as you can't meet whatever standard we've set, well, then we're going to label you a failure. We're going to discredit you and reject you. And if you do something, well, we're going to find a way to discredit that as well. Why? Because it says their goal was to test him. Not to prove him, just to test him. And Jesus refuses to engage what he knows is only intended to discredit. In fact, he closes the door in a very decisive way. He gets in the boat and he sails away. He says, no sign's going to be given to this generation. Well, that is the blindness of the Pharisees. Now we're going to deal with the spiritual deafness of the disciples. And here's what gets it started. They had forgotten to take bread and did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them because they'd gotten in so quickly. And he was giving orders to them saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Here's how I picture it happening. They're out here in the boat. Jesus wants to make a point, and there's this one loaf of bread sitting there. So Jesus picks it up and he says, hey guys, be careful. Be careful you don't buy into the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of Herod. Now, what's that mean? Well, it doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but in a Jewish context, leaven had a lot of symbolic significance because when the children of Israel were led out of Egypt, remember Moses got their freedom, they led out, they had to leave fast. It says they left so fast there wasn't time for the bread to rise. And so when they would celebrate Passover, remember their deliverance, they would eat unleavened bread, a memorial to the fact of how quickly they had been delivered. And they would actually clean all the leaven out of their house in preparation for Passover. And eventually, leaven came to have this idea of sin, that it was this thing that could influence the entire loaf. You know, yeast makes everything rise, and so that leaven, that yeast, became a symbol of sin. And so Jesus says, beware of the sinful influences that have corrupted both the Pharisees and Herod. What are the things we've seen that corrupted them? Well, one was a hunger for power. We've also seen their spiritual hypocrisy, and that they became hardened in their unbelief, their rejection. And Jesus is saying, you guys, be careful. Don't let that leaven, don't let that yeast infect your loaf. And so these guys, being the theological giants that they were, took that lesson in, listened to what Jesus was saying, and began to discuss one another the fact that they had no bread. This is like taking a dog to the park, trying to do obedience training, and having a squirrel run by. They completely miss it. Here Jesus is trying to teach something profound, and they're going, oh, that's right. We've only got one loaf of bread. They aren't really listening. And so Jesus comes up with his second why question. Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? He says, you guys are one slice short of a full toaster here. What are you arguing about? And then he does a little let's review lesson for them. He says, do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Are you dense? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said, 12. And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said to him, 7. Now, do you think they're picking up on his line of thinking here? You're all worried. We've only got one loaf of bread in the boat. Were you watching what I was doing? Do you not yet understand? Seriously, people, how can you miss this? Do you think the most important topic of the day is lunch bread? Verse 18 is key. Having eyes, you do not see, and having ears, you do not hear. It goes back to the book of Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet, where he says, hear this, O foolish, senseless people, who have eyes but do not see, who have ears but do not hear. Ezekiel said much the same. Son of man, you dwell in the midst of a rebellious house, who have eyes to see but see not, who have ears to hear but hear not. The context of both show Israel in the hardness of their heart, heading toward judgment. What story was it that prefaced the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark's gospel? It is the healing of the deaf man. What is the story that follows it? It's the healing of the blind man. What's the problem for both the Pharisees and the disciples? They are spiritually blind and deaf to what is going on. And the solution for both of them is they need Jesus to touch them. Unfortunately, the Pharisees refuse to come, and the disciples are still asking all the wrong questions. But here's the good news. The good news is that Jesus came to them. He was willing to meet them where they were. and he has come to us. It's Christmas. We've been celebrating Advent. The message to the shepherds long ago was glory to God in the highest. Why? For unto you is born this day a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Isaiah named him as Emmanuel, God with us. God has come in a way that even with our handicap spiritually, a way that we can understand. He has spoken into our language. He has wrapped himself in flesh. He has come to reveal himself, and he touches us. Sometimes he touches us in dramatic, instantaneous ways. We suddenly hear and we understand the gospel like we've never heard it before, and it becomes real and personal to us. Sometimes it comes gradually, and we begin to see more and more clearly who Jesus is, how much he loves us, what it means to have him in our lives, controlling our lives. Sometimes God in severe mercy confronts us and stops us in our tracks, like the Apostle Paul, who seemed to have no interest in knowing about Jesus, and yet Jesus stops him and confronts him. And you find the result after that happened to Paul there on the road to Damascus is that he was blind, physically blind, because God allowed him to experience physically what had been true of him spiritually, that he wasn't seeing who Jesus was. And yet God in his grace allowed Paul's spiritual eyes to be opened and his physical eyes to know who he was. You know, maybe you are still one of those seekers. You haven't made a faith commitment. And I would just challenge you that you take that posture of a true seeker and not just as an unbeliever. What I mean is, ask questions, but be sure you ask honest questions. And that you collect serious answers. And that you ask God, if there is a God, to open your eyes and your ears to what is true. You see, the danger is that we can simply make a hobby out of finding new and novel objections to which no answer will ever be enough. Sometimes it's simply a process of covering our eyes and plugging our ears, and asking questions as a way of humming loudly to drown out the sound of any answers that might come our way. I would just encourage you to screw up your courage and take a peek. Ask God, if there is a God, that he'll give you another chance to see and hear what he's been trying to show you for a long time. If he has touched us, then I think we should be like those friends of the deaf man. The more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astonished beyond measure, saying he's done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Jesus might have wanted them to be quiet. He's not asking us to be quiet anymore. What he's done in your life, he wants you to talk about it. I'd encourage you to pray that maybe this Christmas, God will give you an opportunity to tell your story to someone. There's nothing more powerful witness to what God can do than to hear your story. Maybe invite someone to come with you on Christmas Eve to hear the gospel, to hear the music, to allow God to speak to their heart. January 7th, we're going to do a special service. I'm going to have 3 people tell their stories. Invite a friend to come. Let these other folks tell their stories. You see, what God has done in Jesus, what we celebrate at Christmas, the changes that he has made in so many of our lives, it is simply astonishing beyond measure when you know the story. Because he has done all things well. Amen?